I missed mine. Usually I take one around 2:30 to 3. I even had my favorite chair out in the lobby because, you know, I've been here before.
Just once or twice.
Yeah. What's really cool is to hear they'll take the presentation, the slides, and they'll put it on that TV. So you can sit in the easy chair and watch everything. You know? So I've heard.
I think people are mixed up there on the half, 15 minutes is off.
Yeah. That was a long meeting you guys had. It sounded a little, it was too exciting for me.
Volunteering for any of the board positions. Have a simple grade from Lear. Really? I didn't check before.
Oh, my. So what time it was? Seriously?
In the fall.
All right.
Just thinking, oh, let's see your slides. And then you go to this one.
I mean, I knew they were somewhere, but I had no idea. It was like.
Caroline, if I forget to advance the slides, you give a holler, okay?
Okay, are we ready? Let's roll. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Paul Lear. Paul has been a historic site manager at Fort Ontario State Historic Site since 1999, although it seems like 1899. He previously served as interpretive programs assistant at Fort Ontario, New Windsor Cantonment, and Washington's headquarters state historic sites. From 1980 to 1986, he was employed as an archaeologist on projects for the New York State Bureau of Historic Sites, New York State Museum, and Harrigan Archaeological Associates. Lear holds an MS in Public Archaeology from Rensselaer Polytech Institute and a BA in Anthropology History from SUNY Albany. It really gives me a great pleasure to introduce my personal friend and sometimes the person who gets me to do things that I'm reluctant to do, Paul Lear.
Thanks very much, Mark. Well, getting used to getting roasted at these things. Not the first time in the last week or two. All right. I want to thank Carolyn Lammy, the office manager at the fort, for putting together all my my images. Everything else is my fault. All the content of the program. Okay, it's a new one for me because it's a new project, so a little outside my bailiwick. Fort Ontario's Quasquibicentennial Crossroads had a lot easier time with the bicentennial of the French Indian War. So this was a new one. Also very grateful to Lauren, Mark, and the conference committee, Christine, for inviting me to speak at this important gathering. Here at the Pouring Out Place, Oswego, or Oswego, as Father Simon Lemoyne's native paddlers told it was called in 1653, on the way through here to establish a mission among the Onondaga. Control of the river, the Oswego River, was vital to the interest of the Iroquois Confederacy, the British and the French empires in the United States, the 17th through the 19th centuries. Today, it's key to our sports fishing industry and recreational activities. And of course, in the big project that I'm going to discuss today. Of course, the 17th, 18th century, 19th century, you know, before you had established roads, water was the key to transportation. And the St. Lawrence River and the Hudson, Mohawk, and Nettle Lake, Oswego River routes were the only two water routes to the Great Lakes. So very important, very vital. All right. And Oswego here at the mouth of the river was a key location. Well, this year, 2020-21, is indeed a watershed year at Fort Ontario, which is known as the Crossroads of Empire, or the guardian of the northern frontier. It's where the French who claimed the land and the British who occupied it fought for control of their empires in the Great Lakes fur trade in the 18th century. Oswego is where the US and Great Britain fought while engaged in a shipbuilding race in the struggle to control Lake Ontario and invasion routes into Canada, into New York State during the War of 1812. And it's where the two nations nearly went to war for a third time during the Patriot Rebellion in Upper Canada in the late 1830s. All right. This summer, Fort Ontario hosted the last event commemorating the 225th anniversary of the Revolutionary War, a series which began back in 2000. It marked the July 14, 1796 evacuation of Fort Ontario by the British, which is the last of eight Northwest posts held by them after the Revolutionary War and released on the terms of the Jay Treaty. Again, 13 years after the war ended. But now, as we wrap up one commemorative series, the 225th, we begin to meet on the 250th of the Revolutionary War. So history is repeating itself with commemorations. Me, I came into the history business with the bicentennial class in 1976, and looks I'll be going out for my history career with the 250th. All right, same war. 2 weeks ago, Congressman John Katko held a press conference to announce the beginning of a 2-month public input period of the National Park Service Fort Ontario study to evaluate the fort's historical significance and suitability for becoming a national park. Of course, John made reference to the fort's long and unparalleled history and mentioned my 35 years associated with it and my accomplishments. Of course, I didn't realize he was setting me up, but before I knew it, he was claiming I was at the fort when most of its history was being made. All right. So got to get some new material there, Mark. Now I'm a member of the old guard. I want to say it's great to see friends and acquaintances from my current and my historical past here, especially John Shear, who was around the corner somewhere. He inspired me in my youth at Vicious Ferry, doing the architecture and the history and the canal walks and things. And of course, I was too shy and young and reserved to really talk to him back then, but that's kind of changed. Okay. Now I'm giving the programs. I've been doing it for a while, but thank you, John, and all you've done. But it got me fired up, you know. And also want to mention the Safe Haven Holocaust Refugee Shelter Museum President Kevin Hill should be here with me, but he spoke at the Congress's press conference, so it's my turn behind the podium. And many of you are probably not aware of Fort Ontario and its remarkable history or what it is. My wife says that Fort Ontario is the most significant historic site in the United States that you've never heard of or anybody has. All right. Briefly, and mainly that's a cue for my friends to run out of the room when I say briefly, the fourth and current fort is a fortification that was garrisoned and rebuilt by the United States Army out of earth and pressure-treated lumber with stone buildings from 1838 to 1844. It was built on the ruins of 3 British fortifications dating to the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary Wars. Stone partially replaced the timber walls in 1863 to 72. That's when Congress cut up the money for improvements after the United States signed a treaty with Canada for unarmed border. The Army kept the old stone fort when it modernized the post in the early 20th century and built the typical red brick buildings you see around the country at Old Army Post. The fort is the site of 3 French-Indian War battles, 2 War of 1812 battles, the site of the treaty which ended Pontiac's rebellion or Pontiac's War, the site of a 1775 conference with the Iroquois Confederacy, a New York National Guard summer artillery training post, a CCC administrative headquarters, a pre-World War II mobilization post, World War II special unit training post, a World War II refugee shelter, a post-World War II emergency veterans housing project, a post-cemetery, and the United States Army Reserve Training Center that carries on a 266-year history of military occupation of the Fort Ontario National Register District. After the Army decommissioned the post in 1946, the state of New York turned it into a veterans housing complex again. But then when they closed that, they decided to keep the old stone fort and turn it over to the state education department, become a historic site. It just took a few years to get the last of the veterans and the families out because, with tenants, once they move in, they don't like to get out. So it took about 1955 to really get it going as a historic site. In the early 1950s, the 80-acre reservation was divided into 4 parcels. The state historic site for 36 acres that I manage, the city of Oswego recreational area that contains baseball fields now, a hockey rink, a swimming pool, a sign shop, a gymnasium, an art association, a theater group, Head Start school building, a gymnasium, the Safe Haven Holocaust Refugee Shelter Museum, a private medical facility, an industrial area now owned by the Port Authority of Oswego. And it also has, since 1961, that Army Reserve Training Center. Right? The portion of the reservation granted the city was done on a letters patent arrangement with a stipulation that it can only be used for historical, recreational, and transportation purposes. Otherwise, the property is to return to state ownership. And of course, I discovered that the history of property transactions at the fort is, of course, very interesting, but not surprisingly, it's of great interest to the National Park Service. They really didn't know all about it in their study. So it's been a chore pulling together all the old deeds and maps and things of different transactions. The British turned the reservation over to the United States in 1796, of course. In 1803, after the Louisiana Purchase, the Army just couldn't cover all the bases. So it went out west and appears to have turned the fort over to New York State, where it remained through the War of 1812 and even into the late 1830s. And that's when the legislature decided to deed it over to the United States to prepare to construct a new fort in the face of the Patriot Rebellion. That's people all along the border with Canada revolting against British rule, and people here in Oswego and on the border trying to help out these rebels. So our government decides to rebuild Fort Ontario to keep the peace, to keep the British from possibly invading, and really to keep the Oswegonians quiet. Okay, because collecting weapons, they tried to hijack a steamboat and attack Canada with it, which they did. Right? What is a special resource study? Well, basically it evaluates the eligibility, there it is, of an area that's been, it's basically want to study and collect information on the quality of the fort's cultural resources. If the fort meets the criteria for national significance and suitability, the Park Service evaluates its potential for visitor enjoyment and efficient management. And it analyzes how feasible it is and the appropriateness of different management options. The Park Service provides its findings to the Secretary of the Interior, who then presents a recommendation to Congress. Regardless of the outcome of the study, new units of the Park Service can only be established by an act of Congress or by presidential proclamation. Apparently, the president can nominate a national monument anytime that they wish. All right. How will the fort be evaluated? Well, it must meet the Park Service criteria for national significance, suitability, feasibility, and the need for National Park Service management. If at any point in the process, the Park Service staff determines that the site doesn't meet one of the criteria, the study will terminate, and a document with a negative finding will be prepared for Congress. I figure we're only a few weeks away from the end of the 3-year study, and so far hasn't been shut down, so something must be going right. What are some of the outcomes of the study once it's complete? The results will go to Congress for consideration and then released to the public. Over the last 20 years, only 1 in 3 of these completed studies has resulted in a favorable recommendation for acquisition by the Park Service, whereby the study area meets all of the criteria of the National Park Service: significance, suitability, feasibility, and need for Park Service management. Many studies conclude that the study area, its resources don't meet all the required criteria, or they find that the existing management or technical financial assistance in different private initiatives are preferable to the establishment of a new national park or adding to the system. The completion of the study does not establish a new park. If the results are positive, Congress will decide to act or not. It can still let it sit, forever. Regardless of the outcome, it does take them to Congress to pass an act, and then the president has to sign it. There's no timeline or deadline for further action. So the first thing I had to look at is the first criteria that the Park Service needs to know is the fort considered historically significant enough to become a national park? So I had to review the fort's entire 266-year history and boil it down in terms of significance. So here's where I started. 1755 to 1763, French and Indian War. The first fort was built in 1755 to be a key base in a British plan hatched in London to conquer New France in 1756. These plans ended in disaster with Montcalm's great victory in August of 1756 when he laid siege, captured, and destroyed all three British forts at Oswego and captured Mercer's 1,500-man British provincial force. It put the British, knocked them back for another 3 years. It was the first of Montcalm's three great victories over the British in the French-Indian War. But the British recovered, and it then proceeded to serve as a base for 3 to 5 campaigns leading to the end of French occupation of Canada. 3 of the 5 are launched or go through Fort Ontario.
Excuse me,
Yes,
could you kind of explain what we're looking at on that map?
sure. Fort Ontario, built 1755, destroyed in 56. The French siege lines coming in, the lines of attack with their cannons. The British retreat, go back over to Fort Oswego, built in 1727.
So there was another fort on the other side.
There are 2 others.
Whoa, I see.
There's Fort George, also built in 1755. Montcalm moves his cannon here, begins to bombard Fort Oswego. The British commander Mercer is disemboweled. All right, cannonball right through him after it goes through a gunner, through a drummer, excuse me. And very quickly the British surrender.
I bet.
They abandoned Fort George, ran down here. The French Canadians and the Indians surround them, and they surrender.
Are there any remnants of those other forts here?
This is all gone. That is probably intact archaeologically. Now, if you're coming to my French-Indian War bus tours in my conference here, we haven't scheduled the next one, but we had it in 2019 and 2017. We're working on the French-Indian War Heritage Trail.
I mean, just, what was your group? Something from the fort?
The Fort Ontario Conference on History and Archaeology.
Oh, okay.
Usually in March and April, we hold it. Okay.
So where do you find a map like that? Where-
Every-
what's your
it's,
resource for that? What-
The archives in Canada and the London, the British archives.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, very common. That's remade from the original map.
Now, is that like from a volume or?
Yeah.
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 Wow.
Could be O'Callahan, but there are multiple maps of the 18th century maps of these forts.
You know,
But-
I live 20 miles from here. I thought I knew Oswego like the back of my hand. I never knew there were 2 other forts here.
You should take a walk with me.
I guess so.
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
The name actually on the map on the top.
Shuguin, French term for Oswego. Yeah. Yeah, the French win, so they get to label the maps. All right. And if you recall, the last of Mohicans at Fort William Henry, the massacre, that happened here at the hospital at the surrender. The Indians come in and kill everyone in the hospital. All right.
What are the names again? Sorry.
Fort Ontario, Fort Oswego, Fort George. Fort Oswego was built in 1727. Okay, that was the big trading center for the fur trade. Right.
That's French.
We. The fort's rebuilt in 1759. The French attack again, but they're driven away. The war ends. The last campaign of the war is launched from Oswego in Fort Ontario against Montreal. Things are relatively peaceful. But except for Pontiac's Rebellion out in the Great Lakes, all the supplies and troops moved through Oswego up the Hudson, Mohawk, Oneida Lake, Oswego River route to get to the Great Lakes. Artist rendition of the second Fort Ontario. All right. In July 1766, Native American leaders, led by Pontiac of the Ottawas, met with British Indian Affairs Superintendent Sir William Johnson outside the fort's gates and signed the treaty ending Pontiac's rebellion. All right, it's 1766. So a very important date. That was the largest organized resistance to European American westward expansion in North American history. That ends at Fort Ontario. Revolutionary War, the fort was the site of the 1775 Conference of Native American Leaders. The British were trying to get them to join the British against the rebels. Only the Mohawks agree under Joseph Brant. That summer of 1775, it's a refugee camp for loyalists fleeing persecution from the rebels in interior of New York. 1777, it's a base for St. Ledger's failed invasion of the Mohawk Valley. Later on, the Americans destroy it in 1778. It was temporarily abandoned. They burned it down. The British rebuilt it in 1782. But they used the ruins in the area as a base for raids into the Mohawk and Schoharie valleys in Pennsylvania as well. All right. It's February 1783. It's the objective of the last Continental Army campaign in the Revolutionary War ordered by General Washington. That included, of course, a company of the Rhode Island Regiment, which were African American troops. Okay, it failed. It occurred in February of 1783, and Oswego can be rather unpleasant in February. Their Oneida guide got lost in a snowstorm. They had to turn back. So the last campaign of the Revolutionary War occurs against Fort Ontario. The British keep the fort after the war, and it was the last of the 8 Northwest posts held at the end of the war, turned over to the United States on the terms of the Jay Treaty, July 14, 1796. Don't believe the date, it says the 15th. But this is the nice painting done by Grant in 1896, commemorating the turnover. You see the British marching out, the Continentals firing a salute. In reality, the British had left early in the morning, so they never actually met. Okay, but they did leave the gardens and the orchards in great shape. Okay. During the War of 1812, Fort Ontario was not rebuilt or improved, but it guarded the Mohawk Oneida Oswego route that supplied the U.S. Navy ship instruction in the fleet at Sackett's Harbor. So everything that went to Sackett's Harbor had to go through Oswego and past Fort Ontario. That's rigging, that's cannon, that's iron parts, cannonballs, powder, everything goes through Oswego. All by water, all by bateau and Schenectady boats. That water system up the Mohawk River across the early canals, across the Oneida Lake was jam-packed with supplies, right? But whoever controlled Lake Ontario controls those invasion routes. So the War of 1812 is a shipbuilding race, and the main theater of action is Lake Ontario. It's not Washington or New Orleans. Those are diversions from the area up here. Okay. They don't like hearing that in Baltimore, though. 1813, a British amphibious attack occurs. The Americans turn it away. But on May 6, 1814, a larger British fleet and force come back to storm the fort and overwhelm the fort's defenders. All right. The Americans had nailed their flag to the pole, and Colonel Mitchell, their commander, told them to defend it till driven from it at the point of the bayonet, which they did. That is their flag that resides in Drummond Castle in Scotland. The family still has it. Drummond was the officer general who ended up with the flag. There it is. The blue part was burned in a fire in the castle in the late 1960s, but that's Fort Ontario's flag. All right. Fort Ontario is the site of the oldest lighthouse keeper's residence on the Great Lakes, built in 1822. That's the second oldest in the country. Here it is in World War I being converted to an isolation hospital. Okay. Fort Ontario, I'll get that later, but early World War I photo. The fourth and current fort was re-garrisoned and rebuilt during the Patriot War from 1839 to 44. That was in response to rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada, invasions of British Canada launched by rebels and sympathetic Americans from the United States. These rebellions threatened to draw the United States into a third war with Great Britain. It was very close. Okay, a lot of people haven't heard about the Patriot War, and that's why the fort was rebuilt. Looks peaceful. There's that lighthouse right there, okay, and the residence, okay. Van Cleve was a ship captain who did all these beautiful watercolor paintings. Van Cleve, yeah. They're at City Hall. They're in the city collection. Yeah, they're in the safe there. Beautiful paintings. Right. Yes. Yep. During the Civil War, the fort's garrison was increased and regulars were sent here. It defended the northern border in the event of British interventions on the side of the Confederacy. The fort's defenses were modernized. They started building the stone walls, and it served as a major Union Army recruiting and training center. After the war, physical improvements continued for a few years, and its garrisons helped block invasions of British Canada and launched from the United States by Irish nationalists called Fenians. Right? They aspired to seize Canada, exchange it for Ireland's freedom. Can't make this stuff up. Okay.
So, excuse me, on this map,
Yeah.
the general location of Fort Oswego, is that visible on the right-hand side? Or
It's still, the ruins would still be there over in this area, okay? That was dynamited, destroyed, removed in the early 1900s, but the city historian, I'll put the red light on you, could tell you more about that.
Well, in the 1800s, the fort after the War of 1812 fell in. Yeah, I guess. Got one there?
Wow, I've got a co-presenter now. I'm honored. There you go.
There's that. Okay. After, at the conclusion of the War of 1812, the hamlet of Oswego, basically it was on the west side. The east side, there wasn't much of anything at all. Went from the lake shore 1 mile south to where the Utica Street Bridge is now, and then it went west to West 6th Street, and then the line came down back down to the lake. And they were, the fort had been pretty much destroyed
Yes.
during the battle that Paul described on May 6th, and it just sat in disrepair. It sat up on a high knoll, and the city was being built to the south of that. They blasted it, moved it with pick and shovel and wagons, moved the earth and built up what is now West 1st Street. They raised the grade on West 1st Street so that it came up, it was kind of low down there. And they took a lot of the material that where the fort had sat and just filled in all the low areas and created wharfs and shipping areas. In 1827, they built their first breakwater, which basically runs from the foot of West 3rd Street out. It's very small. Actually, the Coast Guard recently capped the original breakwater with concrete, and they use it to protect their ships, their boats, at the Coast Guard station. But when you look at it, it's really, really small compared with what we have now.
Thanks.
And the third floor would have been where?
It's up on the hill here. The ruins are probably still up there by Montcalm Park.
On the hill or on the-
On the hill. It's out of the picture here.
Like around.
It's over in
Up
this
the
area,
hill.
up the hill.
Upstairs?
Yeah, there's a marker up there, tablet. Yeah. We're working on that project for all these historical markers. We'll have another tour for those. But that's a nice 1873 view of the fort. It's a section of it, of the fort, where you can see the stone walls being built, the lighthouse keeper's residence still there, longsmith's quarters, the quarry where they got the stone for the fort. But I digress.
Well, there's so much to say.
It's just so much here at Fort Ontario and Oswego. There's a few communities. There's nothing east or west of much left of Schenectady. It has that 18th century history, that Oswego has. All right. The fort's garrison in the 1880s and 90s, a lot of labor unrest in this country. It's good to keep a garrison in a city. Oswego has always been a big labor town. 1901, as part of a national storm warning system to warn people approaching storms and hurricanes, a storm warning tower was built. That was equipped with flags and beacon lights. It operated into the 1970s. It's a World War I photo with a soldier on top of it, part of a donation from a nurse at the fort in World War I. And that's captioned "A High Climb." The fort's tower is one of less, I think around a dozen that remain in the country and its territories. And it's one of very few that retain its original lights. President McKinley had these all built because he was in a hurricane when he was young. He was terrified of them and ordered that whole system erected around the country and U.S. territories. 1903-05, Roosevelt realizes Oswego's strategic importance, railroad lines now, and modernized it as a regular Army infantry battalion training post to accommodate about 400 troops. Okay, typical red brick buildings. They've removed the earthworks except for one section, which lasted till 1908. 1908, the fort becomes the first post east of Mississippi to receive a garrison of Buffalo soldiers that followed civil unrest after the Brownsville affair in Texas. That's when the town was shot up. They blamed the black troops of the 25th Infantry. Midwest communities heavily resisted having African-American troops in and near them. A lot of civil unrest. It's the rise of the KKK when it becomes the most powerful. And people didn't want these troops. They were sent to Oswego, to Fort Ontario, and they actually were very well accommodated here. There wasn't, initially there may have been a slight bit of resistance, but that was a mistake in communications. The congressman was trying really to get the Company C or the 9th Infantry back, where a lot of local boys were in it. But very quickly, the 24th Infantry was accepted into the community. And that's a picture of them. For years, I looked at this postcard, didn't realize what it was. White officers in the horses, black soldiers in the ranks. Okay, and there's the barracks in the background, and that is the post exchange, the gymnasium that still stands today. All right, that's one of the buildings that's being studied. This is where the Army Reserve Center is now. These buildings were taken down in the 1950s. World War I, the infantry is gone. They converted it into a hospital, U.S. Army General Hospital number 5. Over 8,000 soldiers and civilians are treated there. Soldiers from the local Army camps in Syracuse, where the fairgrounds are, that was a big Army camp. They got sick or injured, they came to Fort Ontario. As the war progressed, those from overseas came over. It also becomes a big hospital for flu victims during the Spanish influenza. Okay. Anybody here like Italian food? All right. Garibaldi M. LaPalla, author of Italian Cooking for the American Kitchen, in his famous book, attributes his cooking experience to his training at Fort Ontario. Now, the cookbook, who's the author, the TV guy? Alton Brown. He considers LaPalla the father of Italian-American cooking. When his book is published in 1953, it becomes the rage around the country because a lot of people didn't cook Italian food, but it goes crazy. So, thanks to him, we can enjoy our chicken Parmesan. Pretty cool part of the fort's history. All right. These are some of the soldiers. This guy was from Canada, enlisted in the army, gets injured, comes to Oswego, recovers here, marries a local girl, becomes a city cop. All right. Seems like a common theme. People in the army at the fort marry local girls. All right. 1933 to 35 or so, the fort becomes a regional office for the Civilian Conservation Corps, big administrative headquarters. The Quartermaster Department runs the CCC. So all the paperwork is being operated out of Fort Ontario. Interesting part of its history. Between World Wars, starting in 1925, the fort becomes a summer training camp for New York National Guard artillery regiments. They practice with their guns at the Johnson Farm east of the fort. That's now where the nuclear plants are, but they live in tents at the fort. Governor's Day, 1929-31, Franklin D. Roosevelt comes to inspect them. He went on this every summer, a 2-week tour of National Guard camps. And these guys are his favorite, I believe, the 258th Field Artillery National Guard. Teddy, his cousin, who emulated in many ways, was an officer in that unit in the 1880s when it was an infantry unit. Okay. FDR also gets familiar with the fort in 1913 when he's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He goes and dedicates a park, Montcalm Park, where Fort George was. Okay. We're back to that again. Now, FDR is a big history guy, just like TR. He writes one of his master speeches on why we need to prepare for war during peace. And he uses the British example at Oswego, how they really can't get it together. They got 20,000 men potentially available, where the French have maybe 4,000 or 5,000, but still the French are better organized. They go down to great victories the first few years of the war, but it takes a while for the British and the provincials to get it together. So that's his example, which, repeats itself or is a theme in World War II in the mobilization camp in 1940 later on. But he's in the history in Fort Ontario he's attached to. When he's in 1913, when he's at Oswego, he stays at the fort, has lunch nearby, but he becomes very closely tied to the fort. In 1940, the fort is converted to a special unit training post to accommodate 2,000 troops instead of 400. It's part of the mobilization of 1.5 million men in the National Guard in preparation for going to war, because FDR knew we were going to war. Get back. These are the Harlem Hellfighters. All right. That is sound detection. It's before radar. They got giant searchlights. They're listening for planes approaching. They got anti-aircraft guns, 90 millimeters. They've got 50 caliber and 30 caliber machine guns. They're all using these out at that lakeside range, but they're living at the fort. They're training. I believe this building is that post exchange gymnasium that they're working these sound detectors with. They're going down to Rochester. They got searchlights by the college. People got used to gunfire here, all right, along the lake. Also the bugle call. Oswego is like an old army town. You wake up with a bugle in the morning gun, you go to bed with a bugle in the evening gun, okay? So General Benjamin Davis was the highest ranking black officer in the Army. He succeeded in opening technical fields to African Americans troops for the first time when the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters from World War I fame, they're federalized and trained as anti-aircraft artillery at Fort Ontario. This is a milestone in the civil rights movement. All right, the first time Black troops got a chance to do something technical after being relegated to mostly labor battalions in World War I. Black leaders were really adamant about this, and FDR resisted, pressure from politics. Okay, but at Fort Ontario, this happens. I think it's like 6 or 9 months before the Tuskegee Airmen. So, but the pilots, like the cavalry in the old days, the pilots get all the glory. Here, anti-aircraft artillery, not that exciting, but this is where the history, the first milestone was in this regard. Okay. 1942-43, more of these anti-aircraft, during the war, these anti-aircraft units trained at the fort. Black and white military police battalions are trained at the fort. Quartermasters trained at the fort. Then educational unit composed of teachers who taught illiterate and foreign language speaking soldiers was at the fort. That's Mark Slosik's father was one of these teachers. Soldiers who couldn't pass the draft boards because said they couldn't read or write. They'd come to Fort Ontario. Soldiers like one, I know was born in Czechoslovakia, some Italians, they can't speak English very well, and they can't read and write it. They can't pass the draft boards. They came to Fort Ontario to learn. Okay, there's only 3 of these posts in the country. I think Ethan Allen in Vermont and one in Maryland. Okay, I think the one in Maryland was strictly for African-American soldiers. Okay, the first African-American military police battalion, the 730th, was trained at Fort Ontario, another milestone in the civil rights movement. And during the war, probably the fort's greatest period of history, despite many things happen, it becomes the only camp or shelter in the United States for Holocaust refugees by order of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. After the war, the fort's deactivated in 1946. There's a big housing emergency. So all those red brick buildings, the old stone buildings in the fort, are converted into apartments for veterans and their families. People like my parents came home. My parents were both military, Army and Navy. I'm a product of a mixed marriage. And they had no place to stay. My father converted his father's garage into a house for them. And all these families lived in those red brick buildings. But in 1949, they started to develop the fort as a state historic site and a recreational park by the city, but it took a few years to get these veterans out. Okay. Okay, I'm getting there. That's the refugees. Okay. Notice we see any casual, there's a casual baggage tag. Each refugee was issued a casual baggage tag. Okay. Just to keep track of them. All right. Everything. Yeah. Old people, young people, children, babies born. They also had a refugee who died on the ship. All right. The cemetery in Oswego, Riverside, I think there are 13 or 11 refugees buried there. 11. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So 1950s, you have a state historic site. The property is broken up. The Port Authority now has some, and there's a private medical office. 1961, during the Cold War, the Army is short on technical units. They need artillery, they need engineers, because we're fighting the Russians and the Chinese or whatever. We need technical units. So they came back to the fort and built a reserve training center on the city-owned portion of the reservation. It was modernized in 2002 to meet the changing needs of the Army during the global war on terror. This is a photograph of the unit being deployed to Iraq. All right. Right now it's the 444th Engineer Company, 479th Engineer Battalion. All right. When they have retirement ceremonies, promotions, we had a general promoted from Oswego earlier this summer. And also when the unit lost 3 men in Afghanistan, the memorial services were held on the old parade ground at the fort. So it still is important in the local community. 2011, Fort Ontario is one of the many New York State historic sites closed by Governor Patterson. Position of the historic site system was eliminated, and the heating system was turned off and removed from the 2 officers' quarters, and the furniture put into storage. In 2018 is when President Donald Trump signed the Fort Ontario Study Act, requiring the National Park Service to conduct a multi-year study of the National Register District to evaluate the fort's eligibility for becoming a national park. So the first criteria a property like the fort must meet is that it contain significant cultural and natural resources. It's got to be unique. Park Service has a lot of forts, relocation camps, including like the Japanese American camps like Manzanar, but there's only one refugee shelter for mostly Jewish Holocaust refugees or victims in the war. The shelter was the President FDR's pitch to our allies and the Nazis that after establishing the War Refugee Board in 1944, that the U.S. was serious about providing rescue relief for the Jews of Europe. He opened the shelter after receiving pushback from our allies who complained that the U.S. was urging them to accept displaced persons in their countries and territories, but wasn't willing to accept any themselves. The Nazis were also ridiculing the United States for this, right? So FDR was looking for a crisis in order to give him a reason to open up a camp. And he got that in the spring of 1944 when there was a massive push of refugees into Allied occupied Italy, interfering with the war effort. So that was FDR's reason. So he ordered 1,000 refugees from displaced persons camps in Italy brought to the United States. They came from a pool of about 3,000. They went from Naples, New York City, then by train to Hoboken, then from Hoboken to Fort Ontario. But before they left Italy, they signed documents agreeing to return to Europe when the war ended. But they had no homes to return to and faced persecution and death if they did. But of course, as the trains came into the fort that morning of August 5th, 1944, the first thing they saw was a fence. Okay. Just like the concentration camps in Europe. Many were terrified because many had been incarcerated in camps and tortured by the Nazis in Europe. But they got over this pretty quick. And after they got settled in. And though the fort was surrounded by this fence, but very quickly people began to meet at this fence. And a movement was born to allow them to stay in the U.S. after the war ended. Food, clothing, shoes, toys, bicycles, everything went over the fence when Oswegonians saw how destitute many of them were. They remained at the fort until January 1946, after a national effort was successful in persuading Congress and the president, that was Truman at the time, to allow them to stay in the United States. So a few people have heard of this story. It really remained local up until a few years ago. 1981, there was a memorial built at the fort, and a first reunion of refugees. People passing things over the fence. That's the first reunion. There's the monument that they built, added. This dedicated to the Fort Ontario refugees and the millions of victims of the Nazis who never got a chance to live out their lives. This monument was vandalized shortly after. Someone tried to peck out Jewish on it and knocked off the corners. The committee decided to leave the damage as not to repair it because of testimony to the continued presence of anti-Semitism. All right. We've had other reunions, the last one in 2019. There's Bruno Kaiser, who's about 94, 95 years old, flew in from California. All right. not easy to get a National Park Service study. It happened because of a chance meeting with the mayor and Congressman John Katko. The mayor arranged for a tour of the fort for the congressman after he was elected, and John Katko took on the project. All right, he was able to get this Fort Ontario Study Act bill passed in Congress, and Senator Kirsten Gillibrand did the twin bill in the Senate. President Trump signed it on October 2nd, 2018. Right? And the Park Service has been studying it for 3 years. Now we're in the 2-month public input phase of the program. So October 6th and September 15th, there's going to be Zoom meetings that you can sign up for, and they're taking public comments. Do people want it? Maybe some people don't, but they're interested in how people feel about the fort becoming a national park, the fort and the Safe Haven Holocaust Refugee Shelter Museum. All right. So if it is accepted, the recommendation or whatever the results are of the survey will go to Congress. We won't hear anything for a year. All right. After November, the Park Service is going to go quiet. They're going to study what they have, then make a report to Congress. And then after they do that, we'll all hear what they're suggesting. Okay. But when Alan Cooper came from National Park Service in 2017, Kevin and Hill and I took him through all the city buildings and tried to get a grip on the fort's history. And he just observed that Fort Ontario is the fort that just won't die. Every time someone tries to shut it down, it finds new life and purpose. So now in 2021, it approaches a new crossroads in its history, seeks a new life with restored vigor, and return to the world stage as a national park. There we are. Thank you. Well, I haven't stopped yet. Any questions? Yes, sir.
What can you tell us about the Patriot Wars? I never heard.
A lot of people in Canada were upset with British rule. You had a situation where they don't really have that much of a representative government. The same old people with would be elected or appointed year after year. They didn't have much say in the government, so they were upset about that. You had a lot of Americans living up there as well. And so they were rebelling. Here along the border, Americans are stockpiling weapons and munition. They try to blow up a steamboat in the harbor. They hijack a steamboat on the way to Ogdensburg. All these patriots are on it. They meet up with 2 schooners full of weapons in Ogdensburg. They invade Canada near Prescott. It's called the Battle of the Windmill. And they go up against British regulars and did not go well for them. It was a very tense period. And our government was upset with our people for causing this problem. The British government was upset with our government for not doing anything about it. And so they decided to rebuild Fort Ontario for the 4th time. That's why I'm here today. So far, the fort has withstood my administration. So we're gonna keep it standing, and we'll see where this project goes. All right. Just check the Fort Ontario Facebook page and we'll see what happens. Okay.
So, have you thought about what will happen if you don't get the distinction of national historic site?
Yes.
And what might that be? What do you think would happen? Is there some other?
Life would go on. The fort is the New York State Parks operated facility, a state historic site. So we just go on with our careers and our lives, and
What's your website?
Okay. There is some paperwork at the tables up back with the newsletter that has the addresses. Yeah. Oh, we can. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And this, by the way, is a section of fence. The fence is considered is an iconic artifact. The section is at the Holocaust Museum in Washington in the American Holocaust exhibit. Those are 3 of our refugees, the Levi cousins, viewing it with the last American flag that flew over the fort. There's also a section of fence. Again, here's the section of fence at the Holocaust Museum right there. I'm blocking the picture, but I went to the opening of the exhibit in 2018. Okay, they have fancy alarms around it where you can't touch it. It's such interesting, but it's considered where the Holocaust came to America. And so you can really touch history if you come up to the fort, touch the fence. Our conservator doesn't like that. But basically, it's where everyday Americans first met victims of Nazi persecution. And they heard their personal stories of survival. It's where the press finally found a Holocaust story they deemed worthy of feature coverage. And after 11 years of Hitler's reign of terror, it resulted in Holocaust stories moving from the back pages to the front pages of American newspaper. A lot of people don't realize that the fort is also the birthplace of American refugee policy. It's where the first group of refugees were allowed into the U.S. outside of the immigration quota system. So Congressman Katko had his hands full at the press conference because a lot of questions about refugees. It's a story, the Fort Ontario story, the refugee shelter is just so relevant today, right? So that's John. Yes, they've removed it. It's being redone. They had some anti-Nazi vandalism there where they were knocking out the word Nazi everywhere. So they had to redo the exhibit. But COVID has interrupted that. I met with them at the fort. We got some ideas. I'm curious to see how they're doing with that project. Yeah.
Thank you. This was a wonderful workshop. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much. Well, hopefully I see some of you tomorrow for the tour. All right.